Welcome to Astronomy Toronto. My name is Randy Attwood. Well, it's been 15 years since the last men walked on the surface of the moon. Today we'll find out what a trip to the moon was really like, as told by someone who took one of those trips. We'll be talking to Charles Duke Jr., who traveled to the moon on Apollo 16 in April 1972. Mr. Duke talks to us from his home in New Braunfels, Texas.
Well, John was the first out, and he stepped down and made a little short speech. And then I couldn't wait. I almost kicked him out of the hatch. I was, hurry up, John, get going, you know, that kind of attitude. And it was like, is it my time yet, John? Now, John, now, John, you know, and finally he got out of the hatch and got down onto the surface and made sure everything was right. And then I shifted sides, and in the lunar module, you could only get out from one side, so I had to cross over and then open the hatch, and then I got outside, and I bounded down the ladder and hopped out on the moon. I was ready to go from the very beginning. Generally, they gave you a few minutes to adapt to 16G on the moon, but I just felt like I was ready to go, and I bounded off the ladder and was. I don't even remember what I said, but I was very, very excited. Something like Yahoo, I guess.
Well, being the 10th man on the moon, I guess everyone knows who the first man on the moon was, but not many people know who the 10th man was.
I could have been the 10,000th on the moon. It wouldn't have mattered to me. I didn't go to get my name remembered. I went for the thrill of exploration and the thrill of adventure, I guess.
Early in your first walk, Charlie, there was the flag sequence, and you took the picture of John Young jumping off the moon and saluting the U.S. flag. Was that planned at all, or was it a bit of a surprise?
Well, the picture was planned. Each crewman had his picture taken by the flag, saluting the flag. It was totally surprising to me when I saw John jump off the moon, or at least jump up in the air. That was a surprise, and if I remember on the tape, I said, "Attaboy, John, great Navy salute, give me another one just to make sure." You know, you always got to take two and pictures, and so that's what we did. He jumped up twice. I wasn't about to do that because my balance wasn't nearly as good as John's. I had a little problem, especially when I straightened up. I had a tendency to fall over backwards, so I didn't try to jump up at that point.
I guess if we were to count how many times you fell over versus John, you had a bit more trouble. Was it difficult in the pressure suit keeping your balance with all the climbing and rock hunting and experiment deploying?
Primarily, it was, due to the fact that you were collecting rocks and you were doing maneuvers that were in the suit that were strange to you. And in that light gravity, when you grabbed a rock, for instance, and it didn't move like you expected it to you, that would throw you off balance, and the torque from that would give you enough problem that you fell over. And so I did fall over a lot. Fortunately, most of the times it was on my stomach, and I just did a big push-up and got right back up.
Sort of like if you're falling in slow motion on the moon, you can watch the whole sequence and get ready for when you hit the ground.
That's right. The only real bad part is when you fall on your back, and then you've got a problem. not only is your life support system under you, but the suit's so stiff you can't really roll it over. So John, we each had to help each other up when we fell over on our backs.
Okay, well, continuing on your first DVA, there were a series of experiments that you had to set up, and your responsibility, I think, was drilling into the moon. Was that a tough job?
On Apollo 15, it was a very, very difficult job. We had made some changes in the lunar drill and the coring material that was part of the stems, and so it really wasn't that tough. We had practiced and practiced and practiced, and the only thing I was a little worried about was that I couldn't get the drill off the top of the drill stem on each segment. But it turned out with a little tool that we invented to help us with that, it really wasn't any problem. And I was proceeding along real well with the lunar drill program of the actual drilling of the holes when you may recall John stumbled over one of the cables that was the electrical power to the experiment. And unfortunately, he ripped the plug loose from the data station and the power station, and so we lost electrical power to that experiment. And so we had to abandon that experiment. And I was very, very disappointed because that was one of my major goals, was to implant that experiment and get it operating correctly.
And that was just to measure the heat emanating from the moon?
That's correct,
How did that affect you? I guess going to the moon with all the complicated equipment, you can't expect everything to work out 100%. If it does, great. How did this failure of a major experiment affect you and John for, say, the rest of your moonwalk?
Well, of course, we were disappointed at first, but you were so busy and you had so much else to do, you just drove it out of your mind and went on to the next thing. And by the end of the EVA, basically, I'd forgotten about it. I was still disappointed. In fact, when we got back inside, I told the experimenter, the principal investigator, we're really sorry that happened and wish we could fix it, but there was just no way.
Well, it looked like you had a lot of fun walking on the moon, and I remember you saying that quite often. Nice way to mix some work with pleasure.
Oh, well, really? It didn't even feel like work at all. I wish every day of my job would have been like those 3 days we were on the moon.
I also remember you saying that you couldn't believe that you were looking at lunar footprints in lunar soil. How do you feel about, how did you feel just trying to convince yourself that you were actually there?
Well, surprisingly, it didn't feel like a dream. You knew you were there, and I really didn't have to convince myself that I was there once we landed. It just all sort of came second nature to us. You know, we were there, we were excited about it. It was a culmination of 3 years of training, and it was all real. It was just a real, livable experience for us.
Well, you had a lot of work to do. What is it like going through and actually executing physical tasks on the moon in 1/6 gravity, but in that pressure suit?
Well, the problem was the pressure suit. Because as you inflated it to 3.5 pounds per square inch so that you could breathe inside, the suit got very, very rigid and very, very stiff. It was like being inside of a big, hard balloon, and you had to learn to manipulate it so that you could do the manual tasks that you had to do on the moon. Fortunately, it was well designed, and we were able to do basic tasks, though we could not bend over at the waist, and you could not do what I would call a deep knee bend. The suit was just too stiff for that. The manual tasks were difficult because of the set of the suit. In other words, it took a shape, and to move it, you had to exert pressure against the suit to move it. The hardest, it seemed to me, was the gloves. it was like squeezing a hard rubber ball for 7 hours. And so at the end of the EVAs, were beginning to cramp in our forearms, and we're getting tired. It was hard physical effort to move that suit like you wanted it to.
Was the fine lunar surface dust a problem with equipment and just executing your job?
The dust did result in some problem to us about the second EVA and from then on, because one of our fenders on our car, the lunar rover, had come off, and so as we drove across the moon, these open tires threw up what I would call a rooster tail of dust, and it was like being in a dust storm, and it showered down this dust on top of us, which covered all of our equipment, covered our suits, covered the lunar rover, and the television and communications equipment. So we did a lot of dusting with our dust brush, which took a little extra time than we'd planned on. But it did not actually result in a major failure of any of the equipment.
Tell me about what it was like riding on the rover, given that you're in 16G and your wheels are flying and dust is flying as you go across the lunar surface.
Well, the ride was very rough and very wild, I'd call it. You had to buckle your seatbelt because the thing was so springy, and the shock absorbers gave you so much rebound that without a seatbelt, it felt like it would throw you out. The only other thing that was impressive was that the back end kept fishtailing. It was like you were on ice all the time. And as John would change the direction of the rover, the back end would slide oppositely. And so it seemed like we were just S-ing back and forth, or fishtailing back and forth across the surface. Though while there's no ice on the moon, it just seemed like we were driving on ice all the time.
Well, looking back at pictures from the lunar surface, Charlie, again, I have to ask a question about pictures. How do pictures that you took on the lunar surface compare to the actual view standing on the surface of the moon, vis-a-vis the color of the surface and the rock types and that?
Well, if you get a good print of the photographs that we took, it's accurate. It was mostly gray in color, though some rocks were pure white and some were pure black. And the sky, of course, is jet black. And so a good print would give you the accurate color. Though I've seen some prints that look real brown and some that look real blue, that's not correct. It was gray in color, and I would just say shades of gray, from a very light gray as we looked down sun, away from the sun, to a very dark gray color as you looked into the sun. The sun angle had the most impact on the color of the surface.
Question about the geology. What kind of rocks were you looking for at your landing site?
Our photogeology that was done before the mission indicated that we would have primarily two types of volcanic rock in our landing area. That was not true. We had volcanic rock, but we also had many igneous rock, and I believe that the majority of the rocks that we brought back were breccias, in other words, fragments of different type of rock that were sort of welded together. And so we were surprised, and so was the geologist, and it was a good geological site because we brought back some materials that had not been seen on the moon before.
At one of your stops on your third EVA, you walked over to a huge rock. How big was that rock?
Well, at the beginning, as we looked at the rock, we didn't think it was very large. Problem on the moon is depth perception, you're looking at objects that you've never seen before, and there's no familiar scale. By that I mean you don't have telephone poles or trees or cars with which to judge relative size. And as you look at a rock, it just looks like a rock. And it could be a giant rock far away, or it could be a smaller rock close in. And so we thought it was just average size rock, and we went off and we jogged and jogged and jogged and finally got down there, and the thing was enormous. It was, I imagine, about 90 feet across and about 45 feet high. It was like a small apartment building, and was just towering above us as we finally got down there, and was, I believe, the largest individual rock that anybody saw on the moon.
Well, taking your whole experience on walking on the moon perspective, what was your highlight, if there is one?
Of actually being on the surface of the moon? Yeah, I think the highlight was probably that time we were over there near that large rock in an area called North Ray Crater. The terrain was very rough. It was scattered with these large, across it with these large boulders. There was this deep crater in front of us, which was very dangerous to walk around the side of, and so that to me was the highlight of the EVAs.
Was there a low light of the EVAs that you can think of?
Right, I'd say an hour after that, we were back at the lunar module for the last time, and we were getting ready to go back inside for the final time prior to liftoff, and I decided that I was going to set the high jump record on the moon, and I jumped up trying to just be cute, really. We were, actually, John and I had planned to do a little play on the Olympics. We were to have the Moon Olympics, and so I was going to do the high jump, and I started to jump, and as I did, I fell over backwards, and from about 3 or 4 feet off the ground, and as I was going over, I just knew that was it. I'd kill myself because the suit was going to split open and I was going to be dead. But it turned out the suit held, and I bounced up, and I was very embarrassed, but very scared also. So that was the low point.
That's one thing we really haven't talked about, and that is there's absolutely no way you could possibly get to the moon and do everything that you did without the thousands and thousands of people back on Earth supporting you. But on the other hand, it's not easy to do a lot of work with thousands of people looking over your shoulder, because every little mistake you make, they're going to see it.
Yes, in effect that was true. Certainly the astronauts realized the importance of the teamwork of the whole NASA team, both contractors and government personnel. And without their dedication and effort, you couldn't have made it. So it was certainly a teamwork adventure.
How did the liftoff from the moon compare to the landing?
I thought the liftoff was very exciting. It was also dynamic. It was very quick, it seemed like. We bounced off the moon a lot quicker than I expected as we accelerated upward. It was probably the second most exciting rocket burn of the whole mission because of the dynamics of it. The lunar module was oscillating back and forth, trying to hold its trajectory, and so there was a lot going on, and you had a great view out the front window, and so it was just a very dynamic and a very exciting point of the whole mission. Our liftoff went right on schedule, and the burn was right exactly accurate, and we were right in orbit where we wanted to be.
If that was the second most exciting, what was the first?
Well, I think the lunar, as I said, I think the lunar landing was, to me, the most exciting part of the mission.
What kind of impressions did you have from lunar orbit as you saw Earth rise? How did it make you feel about your home planet?
Well, it was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen as we sailed from behind the moon we would see Earth rise, and the Earth was a half Earth as we looked at it. And it was, almost 250,000 miles away, and it was just a jewel of blue and white. From the moon, in my mind's eye, I don't remember seeing any of the continents, but I do have vivid recollections of the white of the snow in the clouds and the crystal blue of the water. And this little half of a ball just hung up in the blackness of space. And as you came around, it would slowly rise above the lunar surface, and you could see the brown of the lunar surface, or the gray of the surface, and the blackness of space, and then this little jewel of Earth. And as it began to rise and above the lunar surface, then that faded out of the bottom of the window, and then you were just looking at the Earth just hung in the blackness of space.
Well, I remember you saying that one of the most impressionable parts of your trip was when you and Ken Mattingly went out of the command module to retrieve some experimental film and results of the lunar orbit science.
That's right.
How did that impact you, Charlie?
Well, again, I felt like, as I viewed Earth, that it was, again, a little jewel. By now, though, it was almost a new Earth, and there was very little visible, just a little, I call it a thin sliver of blue and white. And as I rolled around to the left and looked over my left shoulder, there was the enormous moon, and it was about full moon and about 50,000 miles away. And at that instant, I felt like I wasn't a player, but I was an observer, or the audience of this big play that is going on. And the stage is the spacecraft, and the Earth was in one wing and of the stage, and the moon was in the other, and it was like you could see it. You had the feeling that you were just observing it all, and you weren't really participating. It was a tremendous feeling of freedom to be outside and floating free of the spacecraft.
Well, all good things must come to an end, and I guess your re-entry and splashdown were the last events. Was the increase of G's as you re-entered the atmosphere, was it quite a shock to your system after being weightless for so long?
I would say it was. We entered the atmosphere at almost 39,000 feet per second velocity. We were right on trajectory and right on schedule. The upper atmosphere, as the spacecraft plunged into this very thin upper atmosphere, began to light up outside as we ionized the gases of the upper atmosphere. And as you did that, inside, the G level began to rise. And quickly we were above 7 Gs. And I felt like there was a big elephant sitting on my chest. And going from 0 to 7.5 so quickly was a little surprise. But as a fighter pilot, you're used to Gs, and you start adapting quickly. And during the time we were above this high G level, we had no problem seeing the instrument panels or performing the functions that we had to do as a crewman to get us down safely. It just felt like you were being really pressed back into the couch, and you'd wish that big elephant would get off your chest.
Was the splashdown just like a big thud?
It was more than a big thud to me. We hit like a ton of bricks, and I wasn't really prepared for splashdown. I was excited about being so close to target. The aircraft carrier Ticonderoga said they had us in sight, and that the helicopters were airborne. And so I was sort of taking a peek out the window, and I was up on my elbows, if you will, and trying trying to look out the right window, and I wanted to be in the correct position when we landed. And so I was listening to Ken Mattingly, who was calling out the altitude, and he was calling 500 feet, 400 feet, 300. And when I said, at 200, I'll put my head back and get in position and brace myself. Well, he called 200, and before I could move, he called 100, and when he called 100, we hit the water. And so I had a sort of a little whiplash, and my head went back and hit the couch strut. And all I saw was stars there for a little bit. It almost knocked me unconscious, and before I could jettison the parachutes, we had flipped over upside down in what was called stable 2 in Apollo, which meant the thing was floating inverted and was going to stay there until we righted it, and which we began to do. And by this time I was okay, and looking out the window underwater, and then we pumped up some big balloons, and the spacecraft flipped back over almost instantly. And then within 45 minutes after touchdown, we were back on board the carrier. And that was the end of a great 11-day adventure.
Well, when you look at the moon here in 1987, obviously the memories are there. Have they changed over the past 15 years?
Oh, I've mellowed, I'm sure. You know, you talk about it so much, and people ask you so many questions, and I can't say I take it for granted now, because it's still a tremendous adventure in my life, and it's still a believable, real adventure. As I look at the moon, you know, a thought passes my mind that, you know, there I was, and what a great thrill it was. I can't say that I have really dramatically changed as a result of the mission.
Well, you told me that you and your wife are working on a book. What's that about?
Well, it's going to be about, you know, really the life of Charlie Duke, how I got involved in the space program, how I fell in love with flying airplanes, and how I got to test pilot school, which led to the space program, and all my relationship with the other astronauts, and the training, and a lot of what we've talked about today, you know, what it was like being on the moon, and then what's happened to Charlie Duke since he got back, as I've gone from astronaut to businessman to Christian lay witness to, you know, those kind of things in my life that are very meaningful.
Well, it's certainly been a pleasure. Thank you very much for sharing your incredible flight with us today. I really feel like I was along for the ride, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers do too.
Well, I enjoyed talking to you, Randy. I hope it turns out real well for you. God bless you. Something on that nature that he couldn't see from his side of the spacecraft. And so I divided my time between the inside and the outside, if you will, and kept calling out altitude, rate of descent, fuel states primarily, and right on schedule we got a little blue light came on inside that said lunar contact. And when we got that light, we shut down the engine and dropped in the last 3 or 4 feet. And we were elated, of course.
I bet. I remember hearing you describe as you looked out the window. It sounded like 2 kids in a candy store.
Right. We were, that's the way we felt, like a little 5-year-old at Christmas morning, and candy store and everything else rolled into one.
I guess the next thing was